here's one quick tip for each and every Mythic Plus boss coming to the War Within Season 2. Now before we begin, there are two important notes that I need to make here, so class pay attention. Number one, this is not a comprehensive guide, and I'm not going to go here into kind of strategies for high-end keys. Instead, all the tips I'm going to be discussing here are basic ones whose purpose is to make sure that you don't make an embarrassment of yourself in keys any more than you have to. And the second note here is that this beautiful, magnificent infographic that I'm going to be using throughout the video is of course available for free on my Patreon, and we're going to talk about that later as well, but I still recommend watching this video because there are a few things that I'm going to add to some particular bosses. With that said, let's go. Now the first dungeon on our list is probably the one people are least familiar with because this is the new dungeon, Operation Floodgate. Starting with Big Mama, the first boss, this is very much a fight about positioning and ad control. Throughout the fight, these drone ads are going to spawn, you want to focus the ad downs, you want to interrupt them as much as possible, and you want to get out of the way whenever they charge. Other than that, the other thing that might wipe your group is this attack called Sonic Boom that is going to target a random player. Whenever you are targeted by Sonic Boom, make sure you point it away from the group. The second boss is the Demolition Duo, which for the life of me I could not find a good picture of them together. The main mechanic here revolves around the management of these bombs. Throughout the encounter, the boss is going to place these bombs around the arena. What you want to do is to destroy them as soon as possible. And there are two ways to do this. First of all, the boss is going to place these circle dots around you. In order to destroy the bombs, you want to move with this circle next to the bombs and then be dispelled by the healer. The other thing is that the boss is going to do a charge attack on a random player. You want to move such that a bomb is between yourself and the boss in order for him to run over it. And next we have... I just know this is gonna be a pain. So the mechanics of this boss are actually quite straightforward, but the execution is going to be killer in pugs. Essentially, when the boss starts, you're going to be tethered to another player, and your job throughout this encounter is to avoid the mechanics of the boss as a pair. Now, the attacks themselves are quite straightforward. There's going to be this frontal attack smash, and also the boss is going to summon these circles around the arena, which once they crash, are going to launch waves. You want to get out of their way, but again, while staying close to the player you're tethered to. Lastly, we have Gigazap, and true to his name, he's going to place a Gigazap dot on you. Throughout the arena, you're going to see these water puddles that spawn. Do not get in these water puddles if you have the Gigazap dot, because you're going to need these puddles for the second mechanic, which has to do with these sparks. In order to deal with these sparks, you want to bait them into the non-electrified puddles. Oh, and tanks don't get... Moving on, we have everyone's favorite BFA dungeon, Operation Mechagon Workshop, and out of all the bosses in this dungeon, the first one is the one who got the most changes. And in fact, I think it's a lot easier now than it used to be. So ironically enough, this battle against tanks is mostly a tank battle. As a tank, what you want to do is to use the hammers that you have around the room in order to remove the plating buff from the robot boss, but be careful as these hammers can only be used once. So once you remove one layer of plating, you want to move the boss to the next hammer in the room. Now for everyone else, this is mainly a boss of dodging bad stuff. There are going to be some saw blades in the arena, avoid them. There are going to be some bombs in the arena, avoid them. There are going to be some red areas on the ground, avoid them. And importantly, every once in a while, the boss is going to toss players. Make sure you're not tossed into the bad stuff you need to avoid. Cujo is a boss that has stayed more or less unchanged since his glory days in BFA. So whenever the boss casts venting flames, you want to hide behind these boxes. And then whenever the boss casts his leaping attack, you want to move away from these boxes in order to not destroy them. Oh, and tanks, there's some mitigating you need to do, whatever. The Sparks Flux fight is again straightforward. There are lasers around the room, there are gears around the room, and there's fire around the room. Hazard a guess of what you need to do. But the most important thing about this boss is that he spawns these plant ads. You need to wreck those plant ads as soon as possible because they are bad news. Then we have the final boss, King Mechagon, which I think is very useful to go over in his two separate phases. The first phase is rather straightforward. The only tricky mechanic here is these plasma orbs around the arena that jump from place to place. The important thing here is that you don't only want to stay out of the circles on the ground marking their destination, you also want to stay out of the way of the plasma orbs whenever they move. Oh, and healers, Mega Zap is bad news. Then the real fight begins with King Mechagon Phase 2. You're again going to have Mega Zap, but this time it works a bit differently in that it places this cone on its target. When you're targeted by this, do not move. Everyone else get out of the cone. Finally, as you know, the boss is going to throw this magnet to the middle of the room that is going to start sucking. Enjoy the chaos? There's not much to say about this mechanic. All you want to do is make sure you don't get pulled to the magnet while at the same time avoiding everything around. Moving right along, we have the new dungeon, Cinderbrew Meadery. Meadery? Oh. And there's not much to say about the first boss of this dungeon, Brewmaster Aldir, which can be divided into 2 phases. Outside of his intermission phase is just avoid bad trademark. During his intermission phase, however, you're going to see some patrons around the room turning red. What you want to do is grab some brews from the bar and bring them to each and every patron. Once the intermission is over, you guessed it. Moving on, we have, and this boss is a little difficult to explain, but once you play it, it all makes perfect sense. So the main idea behind this boss is that, surprise, surprise, he's going to spawn some bee ads from these barrels he places along the room. Once you defeat these bee ads, you'll be able to click on them and control them. You're going to get an extra action bar. What you want to do is to ram these bees into the barrels in order to destroy them. Next, we have Ipa or Iape or Ipa or however you pronounce this guy's name. Throughout the fight, the boss is going to spawn these globules ads that are going to try to reach him. Do not let them reach him. CC and focus these ads as soon as possible. And as a tank, hope you like kiting because there's going to be plenty of running around the room for this one. So the main mechanic of Goldie Baron button is similar to the mechanic of the first boss in the Stone Vault from Season 1. You remember those shards that you had to smash, but then it would place a debuff on you? Instead of shards now, we're going to have these big flaming barrels. Now, these barrels can be destroyed in 2 ways. They can be either be destroyed with a tank frontal, which is this frontal cone to destroy the barrels, or they can be destroyed with a red circle that the boss is going to place on random players. The important part here, and the thing that's going to make your healer be grateful for the rest of their lives, you don't destroy these barrels too fast, because each and every time you destroy one of these barrels, an ticking dot will be placed upon you, and the more you accumulate this dot, the more damage you're going to take. Now, 1 or 2 stacks is okay, 3 might be doable, but anything above that is going to spell disaster. Moving right along, we have the Rookery, and this is one of those dungeons that I feel is going to surprise lots of people with its difficulty. Because from what I've seen, many players assume that this is going to be one of those easy freebie dungeons, and in fact, I think it's going to be one of the most difficult and a big source of anguish for many pugs. Now, admittedly, the dungeon starts off quite straightforward with Kyrios, which is basically the electricity equals bad boss. Don't overlap your circles, avoid obviously destructive beams of doom, and you're going to be quite alright. The only thing that might cause some difficulties here is that immediately after the intermission, when this boss does his rotating attack, he's going to slam into the arena, and you want to make sure you get out of the way. Now, this is where the troubles start with the second boss, Stormguard Goran. So the main mechanic of this boss is going to be this hot potato dot that upon expiration is going to jump from the player affected to the nearest player. Now, the important part of this dot is that whenever it jumps, it leaves behind a stacking debuff on you that amplifies the damage you take from having this dot. And I know that all sounds a bit complicated at first and it's gonna take a while to get used to, but essentially the tip I want to give here is do not pass this dot to people who have the debuff unless you know they can mitigate it. What I mean by this is that sometimes it makes sense to pass this dot, let's say, to the tank a second time, because they'll be able to handle it. But the last thing you want to do, particularly in a pug, is panic, say, oh my god, get this shit off me, and pass it to the nearest player without thinking, because other than that, the boss is going to do two straightforward attacks. He's going to do this crush attack, which once he lands is going to launch void tornadoes. You want to avoid the crash and the void tornadoes, and whenever he starts sucking, you better run. Finally, we have the Voidstone Monstrosity, which seems complicated on the surface, but I think this boss is actually more straightforward than the second one. I think positioning is very important here. What you want to do with this boss is spread as much as possible around it. If you're the healer, I recommend that you stay kind of in the middle of things so that you're able to reach the other players. Other than that, the important tip for this boss is that after he does kind of his big slam attack, which by the way, healers take note of, he's going to launch some puddles around the room, which you obviously want to avoid. But after that, he's going to spawn these crystals. What you're going to notice is that some blue circles are going to spawn around you. You need to move to these crystals ASAP in order to destroy them. In addition to this, if you're a tank, you're going to be periodically targeted by this wave attack, and unless you have a grudge against someone in your party, my recommendation is to point it away from the group. The MOTHERLOAD is another one of those more straightforward dungeons, I would say. For the first boss, the Crowd Pummeler, the main mechanic that you want to be aware of consists of these balls that he's going to spawn around the arena. I know it hurts, trust me, but every once in a while, you might want to interrupt your rotation in order to kick these balls into the boss. And if you're the tank, make sure you move the boss away from the coins you see on the ground so that he doesn't suck them in and empower himself. Next, we have Azarok, for which I was not able to find a good picture. This is another ads boss. He's going to spawn these elemental ads throughout the fight. You want to kite and CC them as much as possible, and every so often he's going to infuse a particular ad. You want a DPS that infused ad ASAP. Finally, stay out of the Quake and Smash. Rixa is a boss all about space management. She's going to have this big attack that you want to avoid that's going to spawn all these puddles around the room, but other than that, she's also going to target individual players with a puddle attack. All you want to do is make sure that you place the puddles as close as possible to other puddles in order to not let the room be overrun by puddles. Once she targets you with Propellant Blast, go to the puddles to clean the puddles. Puddles, 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 puddles. And finally, we reach Razdang. And tanks, I'm sorry, but this one is on you. So the thing about this boss is that you can think about his room as being split into 4 quadrants. Now, there are these ads around the arena that are going to be positioning themselves such that they shoot this barrage covering 3 out of the 4 quadrants. Your job as a tank during the first phase is to identify which quadrant is safe by looking at how these ads are positioned and move the boss in the safe quadrant. Other than that, the rest of the party has a pretty easy job during the first phase. You want to stay close to the boss so that you're in the safe quadrant when the tank moves it there. If you're targeted by a missile with a big circle of doom, move out. Now all of this applies when the boss is on the ground, but there are going to be these intermission phases when the boss shields himself and then takes off in the air. Once he does this, a bunch of ads are going to spawn, which you want to focus as much as possible. How do you destroy this shield? The boss is going to do this attack called Drill Smash, targeting a particular player. If you're targeted by Drill Smash, go to a pillar, wait for the red circle to appear, and then move out. If you do this a few times, the boss will come back down and the ground phase will start again. Darkflame Cleft is next on our beautiful list, and the first boss is all Waxbeard. The one thing that's most likely to wipe your party in this boss is this dynamite card that the boss spawns every so often. Focus it down as soon as it spawns. Other than that, the boss will also summon ads during this phase that focus a particular player and chase him down. What you want to do is to stun, CC them as much as possible, and also you can bait these ads into the way of the mine carts to kind of destroy them via friendly fire. Moving on, we have the candle boss Blaziken, and what you're going to notice is all these candles around the arena. So the important thing to realize about this boss is that he's going to have 2 nuke attacks, Inferno and Incite Flame. Inferno is going to cover the entirety of the room where candles are unlit, while Incite Flames is going to do the opposite. It's going to target the entire room where candles are lit. The most important thing you want to do with this boss is that you want to make sure that at least 1 candle is lit during Inferno, and make sure that at least 1 candle is unlit during Incite Flames so that you have safe space. Now, how do you light or extinguish these candles? To light them, you need to move with kind of the blue circle barrage attack next to a candle and light it, and to extinguish them, you need to bait the gust attack that the boss is going to do. The Candle King is probably the most straightforward boss in this dungeon. You want to make sure that you interrupt Paranoid Mind as much as possible, and other than that, the boss revolves around these wax statues that you need to destroy. Now, there are 2 ways you can destroy them. Either again with a circle attack that you're going to be targeted with, that you want to move next to the candles. There's a bunch of circle attacks destroying shit in these dungeons, isn't it? Or you want to bait the pickaxe attack when the boss targets you. Lastly, we end this dungeon with the Darkness, the the final boss, you do not want to let the candle die. You're going to be targeted with a big circle, move out. Every so often, the boss will do this frontal attack on the candle, move the candle out. Make sure you interrupt cold darkspawn as much as possible because you do not want to be dealing with ads during this fight. And finally, this is all to prevent kind of the life of the candle from going down, but you can actually also replace it by grabbing these small candles around the room and bringing it to the big candle. This is particularly important to do before he does his heavy AoE attack, because then the candle life is going to take a hit. The Theory of Pain is a big dungeon with 5 bosses, but luckily I think all of them are rather straightforward. In fact, if you remember this dungeon from Shadowlands, I think some of the mechanics were simplified quite extensively, making it much more manageable than it used to be. There's not much to say about the Affront of Challengers. The conventional wisdom here is to try to kill off the casters as fast as possible, so that they don't bother you, with casting. You want to make sure you interrupt the necrotic bolts. You want to stay out of bad stuff underground as much as possible. Xav the Unfallen has 2 main mechanics that you need to be aware of. The most important mechanic is that you want to nuke down this flag as soon as possible, because the flag places a slow on you. Nuking the flag will make avoiding his combo attacks a whole lot easier. Other than that, as you know, the boss is going to select 2 people to duel. The conventional wisdom here is to let win the player who has their cooldowns ready, but if you're paired up, let's say with a friend who recently rolled higher than you on that trinket you always wanted, maybe this is the time to set it right. With Gorchomp, there are 2 things you should be aware of. The important thing to note about his pull attack is that if you're inside the circle around the boss when he starts casting it, you're not actually going to get pulled. So you want to be next to the boss until he starts doing his attack, and only then move out. If you do this, it's going to make it a lot easier to go through the holes in the meat hook wall as well. Kultharok is one of the bosses that has been overworked massively since Shadowlands. New mechanic is called Draw Soul, and the tip I'm going to give here is that whenever this attack is cast, make sure you stack and then nuke CC the ghosts that spawn as soon as possible. Do not let them reach the boss. Finally, we have Mordreta, which is by no means a mechanically difficult boss, but things can get chaotic and fast, especially in the second phase. The first phase is rather straightforward. There are 2 things that can kill you here. First, Mordreta is going to do her channeled beam that, stay out of. It looks bad. And second of all, she's going to spawn this portal that is going to draw you into it. Stay out of it because it looks bad. Now, the second phase are going to retain these 2 abilities, so you still need to be aware of the beam and of kind of the portal sucking you in. But in addition to this, there are going to be these ghosts spawning around the room, either dueling with each other in the middle of the arena or spawning at the edges of the room and then charging in. Do not get hit. Last and certainly least, we're going to have the Priory of the Sacred Flame, and the first boss is the most complicated. So this is the only boss in these Mythic Plus dungeons who you have a choice as to how you want to deal with it, in the sense of you have a choice of the ad you're going to pair him with. But regardless of who you pair him with, there are some important mechanics you want to be aware of. First, interrupt battle cry, no matter what. Second, whenever the boss casts his Savage Mauling attack, destroy the Absorb Shield as soon as possible. And third of all, he throws a spear, which you wanna... Yeah. Now in terms of the ads you can pair him with, if you pair him with Dual Maul, this is a spellcaster that's going to cast spells. You want to interrupt them. If instead you pair him with Emberlands, tanks, good luck. The next boss is the Baron Brownpike, which just has really 1 important mechanic, which is called Sacrificial Pyre, where he spawns this circle underground with some orbs around it. You need to remove these orbs by stepping into the circle and soaking them. The problem is that each time you step into the circle, you get a debuff, meaning that you take increasingly higher damage. From what I've seen, the tank can manage to soak this on their own when there are 3 orbs, but whenever the Baron casts Vindicative Wrath, or the number of orbs increases from 3 to 5, in which case you might need some help. Other than that, there's going to be some big mean hammers rolling around. Don't stand in them. Finally, we have the Prioress fight. This again can be divided in 2 phases. There are a few things that can wipe you if you're not careful. First of all, whenever the boss casts Blinding Light, you want to look away because it blinds. If you're targeted by the laser, you want to move to the edge of the room and try to interrupt Holy Smite as much as possible. Now, once you bring her down, the second phase is going to start. This involves you running up the stairs while avoiding bad stuff. Once you're up there, there's only 1 important thing you need to be aware of, which are these ads that are going to spawn. You want to CC and nuke them as soon as possible. After that, focus the Prioress, bring down her shield, and then the same abilities from phase 1 are going to roll in.